I'm not going to give you anything about my own opinions. They're written in all sorts of places, and if anybody looks at me on the internet, they'll soon know where I stand on this subject. I'm not going to talk about my own position here. What I want to do is to take a step back and for us to consider some of the frameworks and to get some clarity in what's going on. And I think there is a right campaign. Is it about the right to die, or is it about the right arguments or the right concerns that we're dealing with? So that's why I've called my bit the right campaign. So just to orientate you, I'm going to talk about three things. A lot of C's in this. Compassion, I guess, sits across it, but I'll come to compassion right at the end. I think we need to get some context. I want to deal with some confusions, and that's where I want to look at the ethics particularly. It's interesting, Andrew Grubb and Ian Kennedy were my law professors when I read law, and just because you're bright doesn't mean you're right. And they are wrong in that statement for intellectual reasons rather than anything else. But I'll hopefully unpack that a bit for you there. And then finally, needless to say, I couldn't pass this up without coming out with some sound bites and some clarion calls as to perhaps considering what our core business is, to look at our core values, and to be clear about what messages we are or are not giving. And really, ultimately, I'm going to spend most time talking about the matter of rights. And there is a general principle called the fair opportunity rule, the matter of equality. And of course, it depends whether you are Ethel or whether you are Harry as to which side of the freedoms and rights that the two of them have to appear in that state. I'll leave you to draw your own conclusions, as I hope I will do for the rest of the talk. We'll come back to them in the end, about halfway through. But the other thing is that one of the issues that is prominent for us at the moment is the march of, as it were, rights legislation. And that's changed enormously over the decades as our society has gotten closer and closer to the top of Maslow's hierarchy of need. You'll remember the top of Maslow's hierarchy is self-actualization. And I was just considering, I think it's an inverted sword of Damocles, actually. I think the closer you get to the top, the more likely you are to be impaled upon the consequences of self-centeredness, because you become vulnerable to the self-centeredness of others. But before I get to that, the Supreme Court said that Parliament needed to think about this stuff. And so what I wanted to do, first of all, was just continue a little bit more what Joe was saying and look at the parliamentary debate as distinct from the public rhetoric. And if you look at the results, this is a more accessible way, I hope, for you to see the size of the arguments that were put forward. In the debate on 9/11, there were 17 speakers speaking in favour of a change in the law, and 66 points were made by those people. And if you distill them down, they boil down to those words, and you can see story is prominent in it. Rights were the most important thing as far as people were concerned. They talked about bad law. The question is not whether it's bad law, but whether you can produce a law that's better. And of course, that's the great difficulty in parliamentary discussion, is that you're talking about very, very concrete things. So it's not just about the principles, it's about the implementation of those principles. And if you want to see Parliament at its best, and you might say that's not difficult to find because they're singular, here is an example of it. There's a lot of intellectual horsepower in the House, and if people are there on a free vote where they're considering questions to do with humanity and society, the quality of the debates are incredibly high. So I encourage you to go and read Hansard from that debate, because it is informed, it is people who've thought very carefully. And the astonishing thing was that there were a substantial number of people in the House who were undecided. And you see that as the debate unfolds. So this wasn't people aligned against each other. It was people seeking to grapple with a profound question. And of course, that's what we're having to do now and into the future, because as all three of us will agree, irrespective of where we sit in the argument, this one ain't going to go away. So 17 speakers, 66 points made, broadly falling into those categories. On the other side of the argument, 47 speakers did not feel the law should change, and they made 220 odd points, and they fell into those categories. You can see stories equally prominent, as Joe pointed out, but the things that came out here in the argument against, as it were, was the need for adequate, better, and consistent palliative care across the country. And that, in my opinion, is the right campaign, by the way, for the time being at the very least. There was a lot of concern about coercion, feelings of burdensomeness, the unsafety of the safeguards as they were put forward. And by the way, I would just point out, if you take the trouble to look at Rob Maris's bill, particularly if you look at section 4, subsection C, you will see it's far closer in legislative construction to Belgium and Holland than it is to Oregon. So just be aware of that. So when you read Hansard, read the bill as well. And also this question of human value came up very prominently there. It's worth saying that religious arguments, I think there were 3 or 4 references to beliefs per se. So this idea that this is an assembly of lunatics from one fringe against lunatics from another fringe is simply not true, and it is not located in the matter of what people's fundamental beliefs are. So these are the two sides of the argument. So just going on to the next slide, if you then put them all together, and the vote, as was pointed out, was 330 people saying no to a change in the law and 118 saying yes, then what I've said here is this is Parliament's opinion versus published opinion. Churchill said there's no such thing as public opinion, all you've got is published opinion. And that's actually true, that it's what is said to be said rather than what people actually say. So it's interesting to get a large number of highly motivated people in one space from across the spectrum, present them with the debate and the arguments and see how they vote. It's interesting they came out of this position. And hospice and palliative care, prominent stories. Everybody was telling stories, we know that. And that's because we are both a society and we are individuals. And I'll come on to that one and pick rights in a little bit more detail in a moment. And particularly burdensomeness, coercion, and so forth were the arguments that won the day, as it were. Whether they're evidence-based, Richard would say they're not, I would say they are, but we're not going to debate the nuances of the evidence. Go read the papers in support or against assisted suicide. When I say papers, I mean not newspapers, I mean academic papers. And then if you look at your doctor's opinion, so we're now talking about clinicians in palliative care, these are palliative care specialist physicians, then our views in the APM survey was very, very similar. The words are slightly different, but actually the broad message is the same as the message that came out in respect of Parliament. And I would say that one of the things that was very clear was the unwillingness for clinicians actively to be involved in lethal interventions. The majority of people were perfectly happy to provide factual information, were absolutely committed to care for people, but were absolutely clear that it wasn't part of our day job. So there is more subtlety to the matter of how clinicians involve themselves in this business than meets the eye. And in some senses, that's the debate that needs to take place into the future, subject to whether Parliament has a bill that's approaching fitness for purpose in the future. The current one simply wasn't. So, back to Harry and Ethel. So the question really for Harry and Ethel is who trumps whom when one person wants one thing and the vulnerabilities or the sensibilities or the risks or the wishes of somebody else conflicts with those. So that's the business, because human rights is all about toe-to-toe if you're not careful. It's, this is my right, that's my right. You just got to watch Benefit Street on the telly to see that. So if we look at some theory just for a moment, I don't know if you've ever considered this, I always say this, but you don't need a concept of autonomy if you're living on a desert island, because there's nobody to say you can't do what you want to do. So therefore, autonomy is not about freedoms that are limitless, it's about the constraints on your freedoms, because what you do and how you live does have an impact on other people. You can't get away from that, because that's called human society. And so there has to be a way of unpicking this so that we can distinguish perhaps what your domain of freedom is as distinct from the wishes, or most importantly, the freedoms and safeties of other people. And so traditionally how rights are defined is they're broken down into what are called negative and positive rights, but essentially speaking, freedoms, which is your individual desires, wants and demands, which are what you would call your own personal goods. And you can do those things so long as it doesn't impact on somebody else. So you can smoke yourself to death, but don't do it in my airspace. That kind of thing. The limitations. And you can see that society is perfectly willing to limit people's freedoms in order to protect the safety of other people. So this whole question of what are consequences of changes in the law are fundamentally to do with risks, not just to the individual of the status quo, but risks that may accumulate elsewhere and under broader conditions. And those are the things that are what you might call the greater good. So there's personal goods, and there is what you might call collective or societal goods, or what Thomas Aquinas would have called the greater good. And that's where things like entitlements sit. So the fact that we believe that everybody should have an opportunity for education, we should be able to move around according to our wishes, and so on and so forth. We should have a basic living wage, that we should have access to healthcare, are considered by society to be collective goods, and they are therefore not defined as freedoms, in which the job is you can do it, but don't cause any aggravation to anybody else. That is, you are entitled to this, and what's more, we are going to provide something that will make that available to you, and if necessary, we'll bring it about. And if you move from this category to this category, that's a fundamental change in what is going on. So we are free to die in all sorts of ways. We're free to kill ourselves under the freedoms, but if you make it an entitlement to be killed or to have a lethal intervention, or entitled to have your death brought about, then if that's accepted in law, then society is required to do those things. But don't forget Harry and Ethel and the fair opportunity principle. If it's available for one, it should be available for everybody who can make the case. So the dying are not morally special or morally different. The suffering might not be morally different. And we saw that through all of those stories that Joe told us. To the extent that the lady who says, I just can't even bear the prospect of a future that I might not like is enough for me to end my life, would be an articulation of that. That is logical, and actually that is moral. And these break down really into two things. This is an articulation of autonomy, just in case you wondered. And so on the freedom side, we seek to treat people as ends in themselves. We don't seek to exploit them. We seek to allow people to craft their lives in ways that they wish. But on the other hand, we want to avoid treating people as means to ends. In other words, if I want my life ended, and that is at the risk of someone else having their life ended without their permission or against their wishes, then that's a violation of that component. And that's why the issue of safeguards is so important. And actually, Safeguards are in the eye of the beholder, and so is the evidence for and against them. And I leave you to look at the literature on that. 308, just got a couple of minutes left. So, to go, I won't dwell on the difference between acts and omissions unless you want me to in the questions. I'll quickly show you a slide on that. So can you keep my slides up in the discussion? I thought I'd come out with some sound bites just to test them and see what you think. Because suffering is a perception. We know that because people who have the same problems in their lives have radically different ways of seeing them. Some people see them as empowerments, some people see them as burdens. They change all the time. When I was young and playing county rugby, I'd have slit my throat if at the prospect of not being able to do 100 metres in 11.5 seconds. I'd be lucky if I could get to the end of 100 metres now. But that doesn't mean I wish my life to end, because my perception of myself then, that self, is very different from this self. You got that from the song at the beginning, from Arthur, was it? Yeah, sorry, I got the name wrong, but the one, the anvil thing, is that views change according to circumstance, and they're not necessarily fixed. So I'm wondering whether this is a reliable vision. I think it is a realizable vision, but it will take a lot for us to do. But I think this is our day job. I think our day job is to help people as they seek to transcend, overcome, or conquer their suffering. That's in the context of terminal illness and so on and so forth. We can't change the whole planet, obviously. I think that's our core business, because I think our core business is about suffering uncertainty, and I've written on that subject. And it's about creating decision space. It's about giving people the chance to change and the opportunities to reflect about change. Change that goes on inside here. Richard talked about what was going on inside here when he was facing his mortality. Actually, the pain and the suffering was what was going on inside him, not what was going on biologically. He said that. We should help people complete lives. I think our core values, certainly these are my core values, is that I always say to people, I might not be able to make a difference, but you know what, I'm not going to stop trying, and I'm going to keep going. And I don't think there is never nothing more that we can do. I actually believe Cicely on that one. And I also think that people matter to the very last. And then controversially, I think there are some clear messages, and I'm just wondering whether any of these might be they. Because I don't like the way dignity has been hijacked. Dignum means to value or to confer worth, from Latin. And I think that dignity can be felt when it's found in the eye of the beholder. If you dignify people, they themselves feel dignity. Now, people may not do that, but actually our task is to dignify in order to give people the best opportunity to feel dignified. I think we're here to help people to die, not to make them die. I think that change is always possible because fundamentally the issue is what's going on inside one's head. And we will help you to carry the burden of witness of your own changes, and for families, the burden of witness of what is going on in order that we can seek meaning out of that. And I don't think I would want to go further than that. And that's what compassion means. Pasco, Greek, to bear, to undergo, to suffer, to experience emotion. It's a very big Greek word. Add the prefix com, and that's alongside or with. So compassion is carrying the burden with. So compassion actually is the burden of witness. Thank you.
Thanks, Rob. Now it's time for questions. I can't imagine there's going to be more than a few hundred.
Hello, my name's Derek Willis. I'm Chair of the Palliative Care Congress, 9th to 11th of March, Glasgow. Please come. And also member of the APM Ethics Committee. I think how you define things matters. And assisted dying ends up meaning so many different things to so many different people. And I'm afraid I think that the stories ran into that danger. Because Tony Bland was not assisted dying. Neither was the lady who had ME, where she was actually actively given an overdose to die. And most of the people who are in the high-profile cases, for legislation of assisted dying, it would not solve it. So if you believe in assisted dying, you have to be the person yourself that is actually taking the drug that kills yourself. So if we agree with that, that's where we have to start. And I think it's really unhelpful to lump Tony Bland in with assisted dying and euthanasia. Because to my mind, what the core of that argument was about was, did we just have a duty for providing basic care, which what could be argued was him having the nasogastric tube, or was the nasogastric tube treatment? And if you say that the nasogastric tube was treatment, you can withdraw it as being futile. If you say it's basic care, you can't. And that judgment was that actually it was a treatment, so you could do it. And it worries me because I spent my whole time trying to persuade colleagues in other specialties that stopping ventilators, that withdrawing antibiotics isn't euthanasia. It's withdrawing futile treatment. I also think it's dangerous to make a false dichotomy saying assisted suicide, good, not horrible, suicide, always bad. I think you can commit suicide as a considered response. I was a GP in Birmingham, and this was reported in the newspapers. This is what I can tell you. I had a 90-year-old patient who decided that she wanted to die. She went to have 2 psychiatric assessments, so I wouldn't go to court. She wrote letters to her family to say that she was going to kill herself, and it wasn't their fault. And she even phoned the medical school that she wished to donate her body to medical science, and they could pick her up at 4 o'clock on Friday afternoon, which sort of sent the medical school in a bit of a tailspin. And she killed herself. And she wanted to do that, but she did not want anyone else to feel responsible and carry the burden of it. And the stories I think we miss are those people who've taken part in assisted suicide, of what their life has been like when they've been part of it. Because any moral choice I make, I should live with the consequences. If you're asking someone else to kill you, you don't live with your choice. You're asking someone else to do it. So I actually think that suicide, having seen what suicide can do when it is violent, that's a consequence that is dreadful for families. I would say that my experience, that's just as kind of fragmenting and dreadful as it is for people who've taken part in assisted suicide.
Okay.
The other story that doesn't get reported is that Terry Pratchett did die at home, holding his glass of whiskey, toasting death. He got loads of publicity about how he wanted to go and actually have assisted dying. But when the hospice movement and palliative care came good, it didn't get reported. So I think that's a story that needs to be talked about too.
Thank you very much indeed. Do you want to make any comments?
No, I think you said everything.
I agree, particularly about the Palliative Care Congress, March 2016, Glasgow, be there.
Mark Jarman Howard, Chief Executive, St Helena Hospice. The title of the session was about the impact of change on hospices. So I think it was quite appropriate for Richard to pose the hypothetical question, the scenario that he gave at the end, and I'd just be interested in Joe and Rob's response to that. Thank you.
Do you want to start or do you want me to start?
I think what I can say is Richard raised a really an incredibly important point around how would hospices abandon those people who have clearly huge, great palliative needs. I don't know actually what the answer to that is, other than I can see that abandoning people in extremis would be an impossible thing to do.
As far as I'm concerned, the issue for me would be to support the gentleman with his cancer, to work with him, to continue to work with him, to start to understand and try and unpack why incontinence was such an issue and what that meant and represented and all those kinds of things. Were the law to change, I don't know how the law will change, if it does, because it may not. It hasn't so far. And if the law did change and I was required in some way to be part of the processes, the extent to which I would be part of it would be to give factual information if I was required to. I personally would not be involved in ending a life, but I would look after somebody whilst they died. And in actual fact, I have looked after people who have taken overdoses, and I have looked after them whilst they have died, not having been the catalyst of that dying process. The interesting question to me, actually, is that the people that I have looked after have often taken drugs that have not been sufficient to kill them, and they've gone ahead and died anyway. So it was something about letting go, because I think that it is about letting go of life. So I would approach it that way. In other words, I'd continue to do what I've always done. Yeah.
Can I say something?
Please.
I think that just underlines the point I was trying to make, that it's about palliative care and assisted dying. It's not something that is outwith of palliative care. And all Rob's clear messages that he put up, I wouldn't disagree with. But if we have a patient who wants to have an assisted death, and assisted death is legal, it won't be about Rob as the clinician having to kill the patient, because the patient will need to make that decision themselves and to take the lethal medication themselves.
Can I just come back on that? I think there's a fundamental fallacy in all of this, and that is that if it is considered at any point that you're better off dead, and the legislative structure under the Fair Opportunities Principle, then the people that I worry most about in looking after them are the people who are incapacitate or have fragile capacity or whose psychological state is very unstable. And whilst I'd like to say I wouldn't take an action in a best interest, what I do know is if you look at the literature 20, 30 years on, where a generation has passed or half a generation has passed, where legislation is in place, and I'm referring here particularly to Belgium and the Netherlands, and it's not recorded in Oregon, so we don't know what goes on in Oregon, by the way, is that it's very clear, looking at current qualitative studies on decision making in places like care homes, is that clinicians are very confused about what is an intervention, what is an omission, if sedation at the end of life is a good or bad thing as an end in itself, and if somebody doesn't die quickly after sedation, then maybe they should have a lethal injection. And all the kinds of confusions and dilemmas don't become located on the person, but become located on the ending of the life. And I think it shifts the whole dynamic of care. And I know that Richard would disagree with that, but that's just my opinion. And I think there's plenty of evidence in the literature to support that. And that's enough of a risk as far as I'm concerned. You know, one bad mistake, one life ended against somebody's wishes, I'm sorry, that's not acceptable. We don't have a death penalty because of these things. It is important that we value every single life. Whether somebody wants to let go of their life is another question, but to bring about the end of a life in these circumstances, to my mind, is just too dangerous.
Can I say something else? Of course, I agree with you that every life is valuable, and every patient that I've cared for who wanted to die considered their life valuable. It was just that they were faced with a set of circumstances that they would rather not be in. And if we have a law based on Oregon, I think what happens in Netherlands and Belgium is very different. If we have a law based on what happens in Oregon, it is not about a patient having their life ended. It is about the patient choosing that to end their life and having the information and the support and the means to do it. And yes, we will have to find ways to help, as a society, those people who are less able to physically take the lethal medication, but that decision must still be made by them. It's not about the doctor or the nurse making that decision for them. Sorry.
Just before we get to the next question, I just wanted to ask a question myself, really, because I found very interesting the points being made about personal goods and collective goods. And for so long we talk about person-centred care and so on. in the interests of an individual, etc., etc. Are there limits to person-centeredness in the way that we go about the work that we do?
Do you want me to answer that?
Either.
There has to be. It's impossible for there not to be, because otherwise you'd live in a tyranny that was subject to anybody's desires to act in whichever way they wished. And the thing about law, as uncomfortable as it is that it is there to maximise the safety and maximise the safety and individual goods of people within a collective society where there is a spectrum of what that perception of individual good is. So, for example, a society could quite easily say, yeah, that's fine, we think assisted suicide is a good thing, it's there for a collective good, and it's therefore something that we need to provide for. The task they then have in hand is how to bring that about
exactly
safely. So you've got something like 500,000 people dying a year in this country. We have several hundred who are going to Dignitas. We have potentially something around 1,000, maybe, I don't know, you can't tell, because these are all moving averages. If you know, the idea that the law simply reflects society is ludicrous. So the law itself, whilst it reflects society, it also reboots the system for society then to move to another place. Now, people may think that it will move to a better place, but for sure is it will move to another place. And of course, the other thing is that we've heard the quotations about history, is that memory is very, very short, and it only takes 20 years or so for there to be a loss of a generation of knowledge, understanding, and skills, and furthermore a perception of attitude, because you get drift associated with these things. So the law both reflects society but also changes society into the future. That's just an observation, and the evidence in favour of that is overwhelming if you look at a whole spectrum of things.
Certainly society needs to explore its anchor points, doesn't it? Yes.
Bill Noble, Medical Director of Marie Curie. Marie Curie's position on this is that we're not seeking a change in the law. My question really seeks to clarify why we're having this debate, and that is, we've heard lots of stories about people who needed to kill themselves, wanted to kill themselves at various times in their lives because of desperate situations and awful suffering, and they are all very, very, very understandable. Yet it is only those people with a terminal illness that this law is prepared to consider. In my own practice, I can think of people who have recurrent mental illness, for instance, who find the whole thing intolerable, and eventually, often they would kill themselves. And not necessarily while they were ill. It was because they couldn't stand the thought of another episode. So, what is it? And I'd like this answer to come from the three, if possible. Why do we think we're only talking about terminally ill people? What is special about them over other people who are suffering intolerably?
Well, I don't think there's a difference. I said that on the fair opportunities principle. There should be a shelf on Sainsbury's saying taking these tablets will seriously damage your health if society thinks that this should be available.
I think that the reason why the law has been framed in that way is because once you begin to try to frame a law that covers every eventuality, as Rob has indicated to some extent, it becomes unmanageable. And the difficulty is, does one say to that group of people for whom a law could be framed and to be made manageable, well, sorry, chaps, you've just got to keep suffering? Or do you try to do that, even though you know it won't completely deal with every bit of suffering in society? And I think that's worth doing for that group of people. If you want to start a campaign for everybody who's suffering from medical illnesses, then do so.
I think, as my personal stories showed, a lot of those were people who would have been precluded from Maris's bill. I'm wondering whether it was something around, as Richard's just said, starting something small, but maybe with a view then to extending that in the future.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Susanne de Wolflinder. I'm working as a quality improvement facilitator for the OAK project at the Cicely Saunders Institute. However, I would like to add a comment as a nurse from Switzerland. I just need to say that the Swiss government installed the National Palliative Care Strategy in 2008 in response to exit and Dignitas, just to avoid the suicide rate, basically, in Switzerland. So, because we need to think that exit and Dignitas, that it is a business and it's not open for everybody, and it's not as straightforward, and they do not have outcome data what happened to family after the relative has died, for instance. The other example is, I want to share with you is, I was working as a nurse on the wards, and it's not legal for exit or Dignitas to come to a hospital, not in all hospitals, some in the French part it is now, but in Lausanne. So I was working as a nurse, was basically newly qualified, and it was a palliative care bed, and in this bed was a man, and he was at risk of choking to death, and we worked with him intensely, as you all know, and as we all have been in the past, to relieve his suffering and to talk with him through. And after these 6 weeks, he said, that's it, I'm a member of the exit, which is a must. You have to be a member, otherwise you can't benefit from it. And I'm going to home and die. So we helped him to get ready, and the next day, a cake came to the ward, and nobody was eating a piece of cake. So what I was trying to say to you is that there is a flip side to the coin as well, and we were hopelessly, we didn't know how to deal with that situation. So that made me come to England to learn palliative care from its origin and to know what palliative care actually is. Thank you.
Thank you for that comment.
It's just a thought, really, because the reason I came onto this session was about the impact on hospices. So if it were to go through, I think without doubt, the whole model of hospice would have to change, because it's a slice of who we are. You're going to have people working in hospices who believe that it's the right thing, those that don't believe it's the right thing. Some will leave because they don't feel comfortable working in an environment where they don't agree with this. And I think it will make it incredibly hard for fundraising as well, because you're going to have people who say, I will not raise funds for an organisation who actually is killing my loved ones. I'm an ambassador for Hospice in the Weald, and a lot of what I have to do is to actually demystify the myths. And a lot of people still say to me, I wouldn't want to go into a hospice because it means I will die. And the jury's out for me about whether this is right or this is wrong. But I think the practical impact of it being legal is that hospices, as we know it, will change. Fundraising will change. And I fear for the problems that anybody who's worked in an abortion clinic or anything to do with cruelty to animals will have a backlash in a similar way to that, because there are people who believe so strongly it's wrong, and you have people who believe so strongly it's right. So it's just, some food for thought about, if it happens, how we're going to cope with the impact of it. It was just a thought.
Just before the panel responds to that, and thank you for the points that you've made, we are in the land of deep feelings, and there are very strongly held views over here and very strongly held views over there, and that, of course, goes throughout the public, so inevitably serious implications for hospices. But panel, do you want to comment?
Could it be that we, if the law were to change, that we could have a Dignitas type model here, so that assisted suicide, assisted dying is kept out of mainstream healthcare and palliative care. That is, some people may suggest that's an absolute cop-out. For other people, it would sort out all of those problems of conflict that you have just identified. It's a thought.
Can I say something?
Yes.
Hospices have changed enormously since I started working in one in 1983. They change all the time, and yes, I'm sure they will continue to change. But 82% of the population support assisted dying. And I suspect that if hospices carry on caring for people who have an assisted death, the public will soon understand that they are not being killed any more than they are being killed now. And that the fundraising issue, which it may be a problem to begin with, but I'm pretty sure it will settle.
Things will change. There is no two ways about that, and in my opinion they'll change for the worse because of the selection out, and that's the clear practical consequence of law influencing society, which in due course influences law. And that's really why I put that last slide up, by being clear as to what it is we should be looking at. And as far as I'm concerned, my day job is as far as possible to help people complete their lives well and not to die death badly. One, to engage with their suffering and to assist them to transcend or conquer that. And three, I'm not going to give up doing that. And even if the law did change, and it may well not change in my professional lifetime, I would still hold on to that, but I'm not sure how many people would. At the moment, only 4% of palliative care physicians are willing to, based on the law that was proposed, would be willing to assist actively in assisted suicide. How that would change over time, I have no idea. But I am not encouraged at all by the evidence from legislatures where it has changed, and that includes Oregon. And I would encourage you to go and look at the literature objectively for yourself and scrutinize it, and make sure you look for problems and not benefits, because what matters are the problems, because the problem of an individual who gets exposed to this is, as it were, the last problem they'll ever have.
Just check there isn't anybody else. There's a little phrase that I picked up about 10 years ago when I was doing a bit of research myself, and this phrase talked about the edge of awareness. The people that take me to the edge of my awareness the most frequently are my children. But I think we've been taken to the edge maybe of our awareness in that debate, because it pushes us. It pushes us to think and to think hard, and all our speakers are united in that. We need to think very carefully. We need to look to the facts. We need to go to source material. I have learnt an enormous amount today. I'm sure you have. We're greatly indebted to the preparation and the time that you put into today. And perhaps you would like to thank them in the usual way.